You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme. Does Scotland's future include more oil exploration? We hear from Scotland's First Minister as a political row rumbles on. 5 more years of Formula One in Barcelona as the venue commits to take account of the climate emergency. And on Record Store Day, we hear from the musicians doing their bit to make the industry more sustainable. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Let's start today over at our data dashboard where you can see that renewables, mostly wind today, with some solar and hydro, making up around 40%, just over 40% of British electricity generation right now. What you can't see there is the regional breakdown. And in Scotland today, 70% of their power is coming from wind, with the remainder from hydroelectric and nuclear power, meaning their energy is all low carbon. But Scotland's economy continues to depend on the export of oil and gas from the North Sea oil fields, and a political row over whether to continue to develop more rumbles on. Last week, after months of pressure from environmentalists, Nicola Sturgeon voiced her opposition to the Cambo oil field, saying the proposed development should be blocked on climate grounds. That position provoked something of a backlash in Holyrood. James Matthews spoke to Nicola Sturgeon earlier today as the SNP's annual conference began.
I'm at the Whiteley wind farm outside Glasgow, the city that these things power. 215 wind turbines here generating power for 350,000 homes. This is Eaglesham Moor. It's also the UK's largest onshore wind farm. Nicola Sturgeon has chosen this as the location to launch her party's SNP conference, the November conference. She conducted a round of interviews, as she typically does with journalists. I took the opportunity to ask her about power, not these things, but Cambo, the oil field off Shetland. Controversial project, ultimately a decision for the UK government as to whether or not there's drilling in Cambo. Nicola Sturgeon came out recently in opposition to it, said it shouldn't be given the green light. That prompted something of a backlash in SNP ranks as well as anywhere else. Colleagues, people within the independence movement, said that could create unemployment. It could lead to imported fossil fuels and ultimately be bad at the polls for the SNP. So controversial. I asked Nicola Sturgeon about her opposition to Cambo. There are colleagues of yours in the independence movement, some friends, some not so much, who say that your opposition to the Cambo oil field will lead to unemployment, imported fossil fuels, and it could ultimately cost independence. Are they right?
Look, I think, no, they're not right. They're fundamentally wrong, and I think it's frankly just either a misrepresentation of my position or an oversimplification of the issue. The starting point here is the science tells us we need to move away globally from fossil fuels. Scotland has got to play its part on that. But the question is how we do that. And the starting point that is not contested, certainly not in my mind, is that we mustn't leave those who work in the oil and gas sector right now on the economic scrap heap, and we mustn't become more reliant on imported oil and gas. So that is, how do you make that transition without either of those things happening? And that is about, well, let me finish the point, that is about investing in the alternatives, the renewable, low-carbon sources of energy, doing that in a way that delivers jobs and economic benefit down the supply chain in Scotland. Is that an easy task? No. That's a difficult transition, but it is one no country in the world, certainly no country that is currently producing fossil fuels, can shy away from. And anybody who tries to deny that that challenge is very real, but that we've got to confront that challenge, frankly, is not thinking as carefully and as hard as they should be about the climate emergency and the imperative of tackling that.
Nicola Sturgeon there. If Cambo does get the green light, drilling could start as early as next year and continue for 25 years, yielding hundreds of millions of barrels of oil. The UK government is in favour. The Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, said recently 100% Cambo should get the go-ahead.
James Matthews there reporting. Now, in some of today's other climate news, 13 people have been arrested after Extinction Rebellion activists blocked Amazon warehouses across the UK. The protesters have been staging Black Friday demonstrations, accusing Amazon of being environmentally destructive. The group blocked multiple site entrances using bamboo structures and say they plan to stay for at least 48 hours. Thousands of miles of England's wildlife-rich hedgerows could be under threat without urgent action to fill new gaps in farming policy. That's according to the RSPB, who say that healthy and well-managed hedgerows provide benefits to wildlife as well as absorbing large amounts of carbon essential to tackling the climate crisis. The Spanish will retain a Formula One Grand Prix until 2026, it was announced today. As part of the agreement, the Barcelona venue will implement sustainability upgrades. The Catalan minister responsible referred explicitly to climate change, saying, "We want the circuit to become an exponent of the green transformation and the adaptation of infrastructures to the demands of the climate emergency." While motor racing doesn't shout climate friendly, Formula One is branding itself as a leader in the field. The F1 have undertaken a detailed carbon footprint analysis, and they estimate that around 256,000 tonnes of CO2 is generated each race season. Remarkably, of this, only 0.7% of the carbon emissions comes from the cars themselves. 45% comes from the massive road, sea and air logistics involved in the global events. In 2019, Formula One announced the ambition to be net zero by 2030. Under this plan, all facilities, factories and venues will be using 100% renewable electricity. Logistics and travel efficiency will be improved to use the least carbon-intensive transport available. And all race cars will be powered by sustainably fuelled hybrid power units. That element begins next season, when F1 cars will have to use 10% sustainable fuel. North Sea cod, one of Britain's favourite fish, has lost its sustainability certification for a third year due to deep worries about stock levels. But now an online platform has teamed up with marine conservation charity Sea Changers to donate funds to help save cod stocks. Stakester says they'll donate to the charity every time someone plays Call of Duty through their app. Well, we're joined now by Tom Pickerel, a marine biologist. Tom, start us from the beginning. How did this partnership come about?
Yeah, it's a novel partnership. Stakester wanted to use the launch of the new Call of Duty game, or COD, as a force for good. And obviously the names was the obvious part. And as they looked into it a bit further, they opened their eyes to the issue of declining cod populations and some of the challenges that was facing. And what they wanted to do is actually use this launch to donate money to Sea Changers. So that's how it began.
Why are North Sea stocks declining, Tom? Where have all the cod gone?
Yeah, I mean, they were really badly fished in the 90s and into the 2000s. And in year 2005, they were the lowest level recorded. But then an emergency plan was put in place and it was successful. The stocks grew. And in 2017, as you noted, they received the Marine Stewardship Council certification. But then unfortunately, 2 years later, it lost it. And stocks have been going down ever since. Now, we believe it's probably a combination of factors, including warming waters through climate change, sort of causing the population to move, fewer younger fish going into the population, but also overfishing. So the scientific advice for the catch levels has been ignored for the last 2 years.
So the aim of the tie-up with Call of Duty then, Tom, is about raising funds, raising money, but also about raising awareness to an audience that might not yet know enough about it.
Absolutely, this is the sort of the parallel key aim of the initiative. It's to really raise awareness about this issue with a new cohort of people, an audience of 18 to 35-year-olds, sort of the gaming community. So it's going to be, I find that particularly interesting to see how we can actually engage with such a community who probably really mindful of issues like this, but maybe just don't know the details.
Tom Pickerel, great to hear from you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, it is Black Friday and it's also Record Store Day. That is a day to celebrate independent music. As in any other sector, musicians are increasingly aware of the environmental impact of their work. Let's hear now what some of them are doing to make the industry more sustainable.
I store renewable energy, solar energy in batteries and use that to do my concerts, right? So I've been doing and have powered over 800 concerts, close to 900, completely by renewable energy. I think that is an element of what makes me a sustainable artist, aside from the actual music and the message.
So the reason why we decided to repress our album on recycled vinyl is a couple of things, really. I mean, firstly, we as a band, you know, our values are very important to us. We believe that, you know, the kind of music scenes we come from, punk and metal and rock, you know, they have a tradition of being countercultural, of being political, you know, and we think that one of the most important you know, political challenges that we can be involved in as a band is the climate crisis. If we can be more sustainable as a band, we thought, well, why not try it?
We've got a number of sections of our merchandise that are earth positive, which is all the materials for them are ethically sourced, they're 100% organic. We've also, on the merch line, got our own water bottles, kind of like stainless steel flasks. But listen, I mean, this is obviously, you know, it's quite small things, but hopefully if everybody can make small changes like that, then it can have a big effect.
It's down to all of us. You know, the climate crisis is an all hands on deck thing.
Things are hard, always, but if you take a step every day toward it, whether it's your dreams and goals, whether it's, whatever, right, sustainability, regeneration, we can achieve it together.
Do stay tuned, because coming up after the break, I'll be joined by Judy Ling Wong, Honorary President of the Black Environment Network, and Business Green's Editor-in-Chief, James Murray. We're going to be discussing whether net zero targets are a reason to be cheerful and if it's time to shop more sustainably. Environment Network and Business Green's Editor-in-Chief, James Green. Evening to both of you. Now, it could be the biggest Black Friday yet, with shoppers expected to spend almost £9 billion in store and online. But some retailers are opting out of the sales altogether this year, saying discount deals encourage people to buy things they don't need. So is it time shoppers start to think about the environmental impact of their bargain deals? Judy, let's start with you. What's wrong with Black Friday? I don't think Judy can hear us. James, I'll put that question to you then. What's the matter with Black Friday and getting a good deal?
It's a really difficult one for environmentalists, this, because no one wants to be seen to be, being downbeat about things that people enjoy. You don't want to be dictating to people. You don't want to be seen to be preaching and being dull and sort of a bit of a party pooper on this stuff, and that makes it really challenging. But the problem is that the level of consumerism that we see, particularly around Black Friday, particularly when people are buying things that they don't really need, that serve no real function, that are just there as a real short-term dopamine hit, and that are designed to be used like once or twice in the case of some sort of fast fashion items, or deliberately disposable sort of gifts, that does have an environmental impact, and it's an environmental impact that you can see very little upside for. So it's one of the hardest parts of the net zero transition. It's the area that we're probably least confident around how we can tackle the consumerist culture that's so embedded into the way the modern economy works. But it is something where new business models and new approaches are going to have to be developed if we're to deliver sort of the deep cuts and emissions that are needed.
And what might those solutions look like then, Judy?
Well, some of those solutions really are supply chains and so on, and using different kinds of energy in order to produce a product. But I think awareness is the greatest thing. Many people are still not aware, so they actually don't choose. Choosing and campaigning actually has a huge pressure on business to create changes. The other thing, of course, is sheer quantity. We shouldn't buy what we should not need. That is something very simple. So without being able to see the problem or anything like that, just by buying exactly what is necessary that we need will make an enormous difference in itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's a stark figure, isn't there, that up to 80% of Black Friday purchases are thrown away after a very short time. But there are some brands, Judy, aren't there, that are going against Black Friday?
Yes, a lot of brands are actually saying that we shouldn't be encouraging unnecessary sales and we shouldn't be encouraging people to buy things that damage the planet. And we need to be aware of the vast ranges of damage, not just in terms of emissions, but all sorts of things like plastics. And plastic is actually getting into the food chain. WWF tells us that each one of us every week is now eating plastic the size of our credit card. I mean, that's quite frightening. We don't know the implications yet, but it shows us that if we damage nature, we in the end damage our own lives. And that's a great incentive to try and do something about it.
Now, governments and businesses around the world are promising to cut their carbon emissions to help limit global warming. Around 90% of the global economy is now covered by some kind of net zero target. But how good are these commitments? Let's put it to our panel. James, that statistic in itself, 90%, sounds pretty remarkable when you think where we were just a few years ago. But how credible are those commitments?
The level of credibility varies massively, but the general direction of travel is hugely encouraging. I mean, if you think back sort of 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was signed, the most ambitious target in the world was probably the UK's, which was an 80% cut in emissions by 2050. And now we've got a situation where 90% of the global economy is covered by these net zero goals. The stated intent of governments that are responsible for 90% of the global economy is to effectively fully decarbonise, and where they can't fully decarbonise, expand carbon sinks to compensate all activity. You've also got 4,000 businesses or government organisations or city-states or the like, but 4,000 different entities similarly have these net zero targets in place. The companies involved command revenues of nearly $20 trillion. This is like the big global economic project of the age. It's the defining long-term priority of governments and businesses all around the world. So there's very legitimate questions about the credibility of some of these targets. They vary massively in quality. Some are really good and are backed by billion-dollar investment plans and are looking at using new technologies to really deliver deep decarbonisation. Others are literally nothing more than a pledge, a promise that we will do this in the future. And some are probably being used to cover up activity that you wouldn't want to see. But there is real progress here, and having the target is absolutely the first step to then delivering on it.
Judy, Greta Thunberg's warned about net zero targets being used as excuses to postpone real action. How do you guard against greenwashing?
Well, rules and so on are being put in, but really it's very difficult because people, first of all, set up their targets and then they list their offsets and claim that they will actually compensate for it. The real issue is whether we are actually putting out emissions at all, because offsets may or may not deliver. And once you release any emission that is into the atmosphere, it will stay there for 300 to 1,000 years, so that the offsets and so on actually failing is an enormous risk to us. And other events add to the overall picture. For the first time, we've seen million-acre fires as a result of climate change, burning down massive old-growth forests in the USA, while we're blithely talking about planting trees for offsetting.
James, I want one final thought from you. When we talk about net zero, it's part of the common language around climate action now. But how many people genuinely understand what it means? And actually, does that matter?
I think that the level of understanding from the polling is actually much better than you'd expect, because it is a slightly technical term. You know, it does refer to balancing out the emissions that we have and the emissions that we soak up, and there's a degree of science behind that. But you know, polling by the UK government has shown a majority of people are aware of the term. They broadly understand that it means, you know, getting to zero emissions, the deep decarbonisation of our economy, and it's being widely used. It's being widely used in a lot of businesses. It's being widely used by politicians, and I think it will continue to grow in awareness because, as I say, it is the defining economic priority that we want to see. And just on the fact that there are these concerns about offsets and the like, the thing is, the vast majority of advocates for net zero, they know that. You know, the UN Secretary General stood up at COP26 and said he wants a new working group to ensure that these targets are credibly met. There are initiatives that are saying if you want to say you're net zero, you need to cut your direct emissions by over 90%. You can only use compensation or offsets for the tiny little bit at the end that is really difficult to tackle. So there are legitimate concerns, and we do need to be wary to spot greenwash. But there is, as I say, real progress here, and some modest source for optimism given the scale of the challenge that we face.
James Murray, Judy Ling Wong, thank you both very much indeed. That is everything from us for this week. Don't forget, though, you can download our weekly podcast, Climate Cast. This week, we're talking about how we should teach climate change to children. This episode is a family affair. It features my own children. You can take a listen wherever you find your podcasts. But do stay tuned here on Sky News, because coming up next, how the UK and Europe are reacting as a new variant of coronavirus is identified in South Africa. Thanks for watching. See you next time.